Well, this morning we have the pleasure of hearing God's word as we continue on in our study through Ephesians. Through Price is going to pick up on Ephesians 5 for us.
Well, there you are. And here I am. Good morning. It's been a little while since I've shared with you last. Now, let me just get my posterior situated here. There we are. Now, this morning, we are going to be looking at this passage in the letter to the Ephesians from St. Paul, and we'll be looking at chapter 5, verses 6 through 14. And I'll be reading out of the New American Standard, which is not that new anymore. It's 60 years old, but it's still pretty good translation. So, see that no one deceives you with empty words, for because of these things, the wrath of God comes upon the sons of disobedience. Therefore, do not become partners with them. For you were once in darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of light. For the fruit of the light consists in all goodness, righteousness, and truth. As you try to learn what is pleasing to the Lord. Do not participate in the useless deeds of darkness, but instead even expose them, for it is disgraceful even to speak of the things which are done by them in secret. But all things become visible when they are exposed by the light, for everything that becomes visible is light. For this reason, it says, "Awake, sleeper, and arise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you." Okay, and on this dark morning and in a dark sanctuary, I'm gonna need some light to read this manuscript, so you guys bear with me. I have a very large font. Now, the last time I had the pleasure of exploring a passage with you, I had been asked to share on a text in Galatians, which seemed to deal almost entirely with circumcision and Paul's wrath at the Judaizers. Now, today we'll be looking at this passage that appears to deal with debauched living and God's wrath at the Gentiles. Heaven knows what my third sermon will be like. Now, let's just look at this passage for a moment, because in Joanna Klein's excellent Sunday school class this morning on humor in the Bible, we looked a little bit at irony. And here we have a really good example of irony, because although the Galatians text dealt with the early church struggling with legalism, and today's text seems to be dealing with Christians who are struggling with gross immorality, the root struggle stunting the spiritual growth in both situations is a belief among these Christians who were lovingly created by God that they thought they knew better than their Creator how to live. One went one way, the other went the other way. And as Martin Luther once wryly observed, the church can sometimes be like a drunk on a farm horse. He's rolling along and he falls off into a ditch on one side, and he climbs back up when his patient animal goes a little further and falls off in the ditch on the other side. But Paul shows us in today's passage how we can stay on our holy horse as we trot through life. Now, first of all, just as we did the last time, let's look at the setting or the context of this passage. Sometimes when you do that, this can require pulling out a commentary or having a good study Bible. But in this case, we can glean plenty of background from the book of Acts, where we read that Paul and his companions were in grave danger in Ephesus because they were striking not only at the spiritual, but the economic foundations of the city. And that was the worship of Artemis. Now, does that name sound familiar to you? If you've been reading the news, it should, because that is the title of NASA's latest lunar mission going out into space. Yeah, it was just a couple of weeks ago. We were all reading about Artemis. And that is because Artemis was the Greek goddess of the moon and twin sister of Apollo. And of course, the Apollo adventures that took place in the 70s in space is something that some of us remember and others have to read about, but it exists. So if the name sounds familiar to you, that is possibly why. But she was also allegedly the goddess you prayed to if you lived in Ephesus and you were not a Christian. You prayed to this goddess for family and procreation. So this not only gave her a central position in Greek worship, it provided the city of Ephesus with great economic wealth. The city of Ephesus used to be a port city, but its port filled with silt. And so they had to do something else to get people coming into Ephesus. And so they built what was one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world, and that was the temple in Ephesus of Artemis. Now, this temple was larger than a football field, a temple. It was that big. It was built completely of marble and featured 127 ornate 60-foot tall columns. And you have to remember, they didn't have, a Deere tractor company or anything to help them build this temple. There were no modern, basic, even most rustic tools to build with. This thing was built almost entirely by hand. And as a result, people came from all over the world to see it. And when they did, they brought their money with them. So when Paul declared in Acts that there was only one true God and that it was neither Apollo nor Artemis, there was a huge riot in the city because all the silversmiths who made little souvenirs for the tourists were going to lose their income. And then if people stopped coming into Ephesus to worship Artemis at this glorious temple, this city was again, and just like after its port had to shut down, was going to lose its major municipal financing. And so we also have to remember Ephesus was the third largest city in the entire Roman Empire. And it had more than 12,000 scrolls in its world-famous library that was called the Cellrus Library. And they had a very interesting way to protect their scrolls because they had double walls, and that kept both thieves and moisture out of these precious scrolls. So when the book of Acts relates that the sorcerers and the scribes heard the word of God and then rushed out to burn their scrolls, it again had a huge impact on the city. And that takes us from the setting to the significant message and warning that Paul has for the Ephesians. He begins by warning them and exhorting them, see that no one deceives you. with empty words such as were in these scrolls, lest the new believers become not children of light, but the progeny of disobedience and disrespect to God. Now, this sort of passage is enough to make any of us squirm a bit, either in the pew or the pulpit, because no matter how long we have walked with God, we all of us disobey Him, and that more than once or twice a day, at least in my own case. Even the Apostle Paul cried out to God over his disobedience and said, "Oh, wretched, wretched man and I." And this was St. Paul, the Apostle Paul. But this apostle does provide us with two notes of comfort and encouragement. First, he is not referring here in the Greek to just people who are trying to do their best to follow God, but he is referring to those who eagerly embrace disobedience. He warns Ephesians not to partner or to become closely intertwined with these folks. Secondly, he entreats his fellow Christians as they move forward, and notice this wording, it's very important, to try to learn what is pleasing to God. He doesn't use the imperative and just say, learn what is pleasing to God. He says, try to learn what is important to God, which means and shows us that learning to please God, learning to follow God's will is a process of spiritual growth. And all of us are grateful when he puts it like that, because learning God's will as we travel through life can indeed be a gradual and growing process. Now, many of you may know that I have mentored college students for more than 30 years. Oh boy, has it been that long, but it has. And I can tell you the one question over 3 decades that these students and their parents particularly have always asked is, what does God want me to do once I'm out of college and once I'm graduated? Well, having to hear that learning God's specific will may not come all at once can be troubling to the students, and it can drive the parents absolutely crazy. But it's true. But there is one thing, regardless of the sort of decisions that we're trying to deal with in life, there is one thing that we can all do that does please the Lord, and that is learning each day in our different situations to trust Him, regardless of what we are trying to deal with, because we know that He will never, ever leave us or forsake us. And we can be sure that whatever our next step may be, He is going to be there with us. And this is the most valuable lesson that we can learn as we move through whatever life brings us. As a matter of fact, Paul encourages us as we do this to keep on walking as children of light, and not just walking as children of light, walking as children of light until we actually are the light. Notice the phrasing that he uses in the passage. He doesn't say walk in the light, he says be the light, bearing fruit in a dark, dark world. And here the apostle perhaps provides a guardrail against misinterpreting his warning not to be intertwined with children, or what we might say the weeds of disobedience. Because throughout the history of the church, there have been well intentioned, kindly Christians who have drawn away from the world in an effort to separate themselves from its many and constant temptations. Yet, why are we to walk as children of light in a dark world if it is not to actually lighten the darkness of that world and to share that light. Indeed, in a shadowed room, light disperses indiscriminately and gets rid of the darkness in every direction. And the natural product of this light is what? It is fruit that comes from the light. The fruits of compassion, personal integrity, and truth, where evil is not even mentioned. Now, a garden, as it turns out, is indeed an excellent metaphor for the unity and diversity of the church that Paul has been writing about through Ephesians that we have been studying. And by a happy coincidence, today is Rogation Sunday. That is the Sunday on the liturgical calendar when Christians all around the world are asking God for his blessing on their crops and gardens. Now, I myself grew up on a farm in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, and on our farm, we had an enormous garden filled with what we hoped would eventually be cantaloupes, corn, squash, which only our mother liked, green beans, peas, okra, which only Daddy liked, and even some flowers for the house. But no matter how diverse our family garden might have been, all of those seeded and growing plants had to have the right amount of sunlight and rain. And of course, they had to have vigilant weeding. So, as soon as my sister and I got off the school bus, we had to head straight out to that dang garden and get to work, trying not to think about the fact that all of our non-farming school friends were in their living rooms watching television and eating brownies. But not that I was ever bitter. However, come winter, we were very grateful to enjoy the literal fruit of our labor, homegrown produce, which our mother had either frozen or canned. And to this day, I have never in my life tasted anything from a supermarket shelf that equaled her strawberry jam. So, in the same way, Paul here encourages us to bring forth fruit in our lives and in the lives of others by walking in and being God's light in the world. Which brings us to our third part, the application. Now, how do we do this? How do we share God's light in the world? And I shall here pause dramatically, excuse me. Well, first of all, we need to stay in the light, which we can do by reading our Bible each day, praying for those around us, and keeping in fellowship with believers. But not only with fellow Christians. Think about this. Before you step out the door the next time, whether you're headed to a busy day of study at school or college, or work at the office or the factory, or, maybe you're retired and trying to combat the boredom of retirement, ask God to help you to be aware. Be aware of your surroundings and to bring you in touch with someone who could maybe just use a brief word of encouragement, a gently humorous remark to dispense tension, or a smile of kindness. It can open all sorts of doors, especially in New England where people just don't do that sort of thing. That don't worry, they won't call the police. At least I hope they won't. But consider further. How can you become more involved with your community? If you have children at school, you're already there. But what about joining civic groups that reach out to those in need? And there are plenty of those. The Ruritans, the Rotary, your community kitchen or pantry. Join a library book group. Those are fascinating and fun. Deliver Meals on Wheels. everywhere you turn, there is an opportunity to help people because the world is thirsty. The world is thirsting for kindness, and kindness can have unexpected results. And I learned this yesterday, just yesterday. I was a guest at a luncheon sponsored by Smith College alumni, which was a fascinating event, not only because I was one of four males in the ballroom, because Smith College is a woman's college, but because the speaker, Anthony Amore, or Amore, I'm not quite sure how he pronounced his last name, has written this absolutely riveting book entitled The Rembrandt Heist. And in this publication, he relates how he became friends with Miles J. Connor. Now, Miles J. Connor, believe it or not, was one of the world's most persistent and most effective art thieves. He stole artwork from all over the world, and including a very valuable Rembrandt portrait that was in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. But not only the Museum of Fine Arts, the MFA, he had his sights set on the Peabody Essex Museum, which is literally right across the lane from where I live. And what he would do is he would take a valuable artifact of his own and go into the art gallery and show it to the curator there and then ask to see the storage facility of the museum. And while the curator had his back turned, he would pocket everything he could. And he got away with this because he was just a charming, winsome personality with sticky fingers. But when he decided to do that at the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, what happened was the staff there were so kind and courteous and polite that Connor could not bring himself to steal from the Peabody Essex Museum, and he let them off the hook. So you never know when a word of kindness or courtesy is going to really help you out. It can be something as innocuous as an invitation to our community breakfast or to a Sunday service. You never know what's going to happen when you take that small step because we just can't get around this fact, folks. In order for people to realize Christians love them, guess what? We have to get out there and love them. And God can bring all sorts of opportunities in your life to do that, regardless of where you are. You might be active at work. You might be active at school. You might be retired. You might even be invalided a great deal. But as this group that the ladies are starting up, you can write letters. That might be a course we all, consider because my handwriting is illegible now, and it used to be very clear, and I used to write handwritten letters to relatives and friends almost every month. And then Paul concludes today's passage by exhorting us, "Awake, sleeper, and arise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you." And what he is reminding us of is that reaching out to those around us can be fun, but sometimes it's hard. Yet it's always essential, not only to grow the church, but to grow closer to God within ourselves. And this particular passage does remind me just a little bit of a farming scenario. Because on Saturdays, my father would come crashing downstairs at 5:30 in the morning, and it's Saturday, and he's yelling, "Get up, get up, get up. Breakfast is ready, breakfast is ready, breakfast is ready." But when his groggy family stumbled into the dark and cold kitchen, he would say, "Oh, I'm sorry. What I meant to say was, get breakfast ready." So then Mom would come to the rescue. But Paul is not necessarily mixing his metaphor here. Yes, he's asking us, like my dad did, to wake up and get busy. But if you think about it, what is a seed but a sleeper, buried in the ground as dead, but which awakens and responds when it rises to the sunshine and the light? And as we go through this week and this growing season of life, wherever you might be, let us trust that God is going to go with us, and that as Christ shines on us, we shine on others with his integrity, kindness, and compassion. And thus we learn what is most pleasing to the Lord.